What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another edition of Sit Down Saturday, and today we're going to be talking about more Fanstoys reveals, which usually is kind of one of the most boring things I think that we do here on Sit Down Saturday. However, I do have a couple of interesting things to say about these specifically. Pardon me for getting out of breath. But I think a lot of times it's kind of like the lowest common denominator, right? To just say, here's a figure. It has arms and legs, and it has a head, and it's going to come out one day, and aren't you so excited? Whereas I think a lot of the stuff that we do here, where it gets a little bit more interesting, is when we get into kind of nitty-gritty stuff and community stuff, culture stuff, subjective, objective, that kind of stuff. That's when it gets interesting. But I do have a couple of interesting points of view on this stuff, and I have contacted some of my friends with a keener eye than mine to help pick out a couple of things that we're all going to address, and we're going to address it here shortly. But before we do so, I do have a little bit of housekeeping. The Grimlock. I don't have a whole lot more to say about it. A lot of people have hit me up. It seems to be a common thing. I hope that they are able to create some sort of replacement piece and send them out to people or get them in the hands of people. It's very unfortunate. It did secure Scott an invitation to Skullfest, though, because I felt so bad for him that I figure at the very least I owe him a meal. And he's been very cool about it, too, by the way. But he's been very good to me, and I appreciate him, and I feel awful about how things have gone in regard to that figure specifically. But a lot of people hit me up and have shown pictures of theirs, the same sort of problem, etc., etc. Shout out to Shoki's reviews. Him and I have talked about it. Like, it's a thing. My uncut thoughts are available on Patreon in the afterthoughts. Jansen. I want to talk to Jansen. Jansen is very funny to me because if I don't love something that people love, it's always a problem. And when that thing is also relatively less expensive than competitors, it becomes more of a problem. It happens every time you can set your watch to it. I've had a number of people hit me up about this figure saying how they've taken issue with something in my review, and when I asked them what they like about it, every single person has mentioned the price point, which I just think is something to take note of. On top of that, let's be clear. If you watch my review, I don't bash this thing. My final thoughts are pretty fair. Had the break happened before my final thoughts, I can't promise that they would have been as fair. But as fate would have it, my final thoughts were recorded and edited and put together before the break. I added the break in post, because it's important that people know and avoid it. I have a feeling I'm not done discussing this figure, but just because I didn't love it, people have put their capes on and decided to defend it like they're some sort of toy hero. Listen, nerd, this ain't Gotham, and you ain't Batman, and I didn't hate your prized possession. I just didn't think it was as great as you did. And I gave pretty level-headed reasons as to why. But like I said, I got a lot more, I'm sure, conversation coming about that figure because I think there actually is a fair amount to say about it. And just because I don't think it's the greatest thing since sliced bread, I don't think it's bad either, people are bringing Fanstoys into it. It's like politics. It's like you can't discuss one thing without somebody else bringing in their candidate or their person. It's like, I just want to discuss this thing. But neither here nor there, I'm sure it's going to come up more in the future. Once again, my afterthoughts for that, which are more uncut, are available on the Patreon in a section called Afterthoughts. Now, let's get down to this. And in order to get down to this, we got to start at the bare bones. We got to start at the basics. We got to start at just talking about the reveals. We're just going to talk about some of the figures, some of the things I noticed. We're going to talk about the difference between a prototype and a test shot. We're going to talk about a little bit about some nuts and bolts, but just sort of a description of my initial reaction to some of this stuff. And then we're going to come back and fine tune it. So let's start with the mini bots, and we'll start specifically with Pipes, who I think looks great. And after handling their huffer, which you guys know I'm a big fan of, I feel like in many ways, at least aesthetically, it's a return to their roots after a couple hiccups along the road. I think Pipes follows the same trajectory, and I have nothing but high hopes and expectations regarding him. I only hope that the elbows have a wider range of motion, and I also wouldn't be upset if the knees did as well, but only time will tell. And we'll talk a little bit about articulation with these guys as we move through, because a lot of them, I think, really show their hand in regard to what they have. Not a lot of cards being played close to the chest. It's all there. It's just whether or not we choose to accept it. I also think that this Pipes is definitely a 3D print, meaning a prototype, and that we're not at test shot phase with these guys. However, we do see an alt mode, and he is the only one who shows their alt mode in prototype stage. So I would guess that he's probably pretty close to release. That would be my hypothesis. And real quick, I'm not sure if this is old news or not, but I did want to take a second and talk about this Outback. If he doesn't look awful for all the right reasons, I don't know who does. Just as I was coming across these, I was like, man, I don't know if I've really talked about this guy at all. And he looks terrible, and yet he looks perfect. However, I do expect limited articulation with him as well. And this is, finished piece here, so he should be close as well. And then lastly, I want to do an update on Cliffjumper because we got an updated look at him. I don't think that this is photoshopped, meaning I don't think that he's specifically a lighter color for no reason. No, I think that is a test shot. So it looks like, to me, that Cliff Jumper is mighty close as well to a release, and he looks great. However, I would imagine that that's the full extent of elbow movement in both arms, right there. What you see is what you get. But very good looking nonetheless. Now let's talk about gears and Swerve a little bit, and we'll start with gears. Did I say start weird? I feel like I did. So the first thing I want to point out is that this looks like a 3D print to me also, meaning we still got a good bit to go before we see an actual release from this guy. That being said, looks the part, doesn't he? G1, possibly to a fault. I think a lot of that depends on deco with them these days, but decent enough sculpt. Moving on to the articulation, it looks like a double hinged elbow, but I'm gonna guess it still only gets you 90 degrees. It might get you more. It's just hard to say. I'm hesitant, reluctant to say, because I don't want to be disappointed. But it looks like there's a double knee bend as well, except the top joint may be ever so slight, but still we can see the leg getting past 90 degrees. So those two elements combined with an ab crunch, maybe I'm being heard. I can only hope. This looks really good to me. Now, in addition to it being a 3D print, there's another sign of it being a fair bit away, in that this is a CAD render of the alt mode. It is not a print. It is not a test shot. It is not a prototype. It's just the screen print. And I'll talk a little bit about that at the end, but that was apparent to me early on. Let's move on to his mold mate, which is Diverge, which I think is a clever name for a Swerve, personally. Once again, looks awful kind of for all the right reasons. Looks exactly like he should, just not the coolest design in the world, but at least it's like abundantly different from Gears, which is harder to do with most people wanting to kind of reuse the mold, so I applaud them for that. Moving on to articulation, I don't know. Whereas the Gears looks like it has some improvements. I'm not sure that this one does. It looks like there might be a double jointed elbow, that they're just not utilizing both joints, and that would get you a wider range. But with the bulk of the shoulders, I'm not sure that that's the case. I'm guessing the knees are 90 degrees, and I'm guessing there's an ab crunch because Gears has one, but that's the only reason. And then lastly, the alt mode, once again, is a CAD render. So I would guess that this piece is a fair bit off as well. Moving on to the Aerialbots. We'll start with Viper. Robot mode looks solid. We have seen pictures of the combined mode, which shows that the combined mode engineering pretty much tucks up inside of the abdomen. I do think that that throws the abdomen look off for Firefight a bit more than it does for Slingshot. It like fattens him up a little bit. Not the worst thing in the world, but I'm trying to have a critical eye with this stuff. On top of that, the wings are certainly an eyesore on his lower legs. Kibbly bibbly. I would like to think that they can come off, but I'm not sure that they can. Not sure that they can either. Once again, I think that this is a 3D print, meaning a prototype and not a test shot. And the main reason for that is because, once again, the alt mode we see as a CAD render, not as the actual thing. The 3D prints are pretty fragile, which usually suggests, when you don't see alt modes, a number of things, but one of which might be that they can't sustain the transformation. We do, however, see it as an arm, and we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about this in a bit. Once again, I kind of wish we could get rid of the lower legs. A lot of people have hit me up like, look, the arm is there, and yes, the arm is there. My concern is not that they know how to make arms. My concern is that they know how to get the arms to attach to the body and for the body to remain balanced. So until we see a bit more of that, I still maintain my level of scrutiny and doubt. And make no mistake, I'm sure they're working on it. They've had over a year. I'm sure it's been at the top of their list. But until I see it, my fears are not calmed. My anxieties are not calmed. The good thing for me is I don't need this guy to be Superion anyway, so just put the bots out. I'm ready. And then lastly is Jester. Once again, I think he looks great. Once again, I think he's 3D printed. I think that he does a lot better job proportionately in regard to his kind of body of hiding the engineering for the elbow while maintaining a kind of more slender aesthetic. And it was awfully nice to be able to see the whole team together for once. Definitely a bonus. Once again, we see the CAD render of the jet. Once again, this is because it's not ready for all that and probably a fair bit off. And obviously we see the arm mode again, and nothing different to report here other than what I'm getting ready to go through. Now, that's kind of, to me, the basic way to look at a lot of this stuff, with a few exceptions, right? Differentiations between test shots, differentiations between prototypes, talking about alt modes, why we're not seeing them the right way. So there is a little bit of meat on that bone, but let's get a little nitty gritty. I talked to a friend of mine who a lot of you will know from Patreon, and I asked him, like, man, what do you see in here that my eye might be missing, that I'm not looking at in the same way? And he was able to point out some things to me that I really took note of and thought were pretty interesting. Some more interesting than others, but that's life, isn't it? So let's go through and talk about a few key points that I took note of, and I also want to talk about whether or not these figures are anywhere close to getting into our hands just because we're seeing images of them.
So let me point out a couple more things that have been brought to my attention. The reason why we don't see the alt modes is probably because they don't clean up well currently, due to poor tolerances or missing tabs. Once again, this is largely, if not completely, due to them being in this 3D printed stage, which is something just interesting, I think, to take note of. But it could be for other reasons as well. And it could be that's why we see, for instance, the arms for the Aerialbots, but not the jets. That something isn't quite right for alt mode, whereas it works pretty well for arm mode. Something else has been brought to my attention, which I did find interesting, usually, if not always, but you know how I feel about the terms always and never, right? Fanstoys hides all of their screws at the back of the bot. But on some of these more recent reveals, we're starting to see them on the side. Once again, not really a deal breaker for me, and it doesn't bother me. It just shows a bit of a change in the way they're doing business, and I'm not sure why. Perhaps a new designer, perhaps a new way of doing business, perhaps a new choice, not sure, but not necessarily common for the company either. And perhaps the strangest thing that I saw in all of this are the heads for the Aerialbots and their location for the arms for arm mode of Superion. They fold down on the chest. I'm not sure why they wouldn't go behind them into the canopy or can of peas, or have some way to fold into the chest a la every other Aerialbot ever made. I talked to a pretty smart guy about it, and he does not think the head is the combiner peg, but instead suggests that it looks like the arms have no combination joints. Therefore, the combination joints will entirely be built into the combiner torso and clamp onto the arm somehow, probably into the chest. Doubtful into the head because of the way the flap works. But it suggests that these guys are pretty close to being done. But being done doesn't mean it's coming out. Because let us not forget, Dead End has been done for some time. We've seen the full finished look of Dead End for some time, but we have not received said Dead End. So just because something looks like it's pretty close to being finished doesn't actually mean that we're anywhere close at all.
So, I hope you enjoyed it. I'm excited. I think Rig is great. I wish it had more articulation, but it's been one of my favorite figures so far. It's been one of my favorite Transformer figures in quite some time. I thought it was interesting. I had a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to what Fanstoys has in the future. As always, I said something recently because some people think that just because I've taken note of some of the problems that I've witnessed in the way that they're doing business and decided to point it out to you as a consumer, we're supposed to be on the same, we're the consumer side. You don't own stock in Fanstoys. You're not a shareholder, you're just a fan, like me, who's spending their money on the stuff. It's okay to point stuff out. And I could kind of say, like, some people think that just because I don't worship everything that they put out, that I'm not a fan of the company. Just because I'm critical of the soullessness of Acoustic Wave, or the lack of articulation in all of their figures across the board for the past 2 years, that I don't love the company. And my response to this was, I have 3 children, and I love them all dearly. I love them all equally. But I criticize everything they do wrong. Well, not everything. Who's got the time for all that, right? But at least the key things. At least the big things that I think, if I criticize them and point out the flaws and show how to correct it, that perhaps they'll all be better for it in the long run. And I only do it because I love them. But that being said, we're going to get out of here. Look, I still got stuff I've been pushing back. I got a TFC conversation that's going to happen soon. I have a conversation regarding BotCon that's going to happen soon. I have a conversation about my wish list for 2022, which I'm going to be a month behind in. I may have to just push that to the front of the line for next week because I want to have it in January. You know what I mean? I don't want to break tradition. If you know me, you know I hate to break tradition. I'm 41 years of tradition uninterrupted by progress. You know what I'm saying? And with that being said, we'll get out of here. I'll see you next week. As a matter of fact, I'll see you sooner than that. I'll see you on Monday. And if you're on Patreon, I'll see you tomorrow. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Until next time, take care.